Hello, little helpers. Today we are doing a pretty fun topic. The topic is disgust. Kind of an interesting one for a mental health podcast. This was something I just realized was a super interesting body of work my first year here. It's really interesting because when we think of disgust, we usually think of core disgust, like vomit is gross, poo is gross, that old rancid milk in the fridge is gross. Like that makes us feel disgust. But disgust also encapsulates things like interpersonal disgust. You know, that feeling of, ugh, that person, I just want them to stay away from me. I don't like them. I don't want to be near them. And it can encapsulate moral disgust. So, I'm just disgusted by the action that person took. These forms of disgust actually all have an evolutionary origin, shared origin, which means that they're interconnected. So, for instance, we know that if you drink a really bitter beverage before reading a moral vignette, you'll rate it as more morally wrong than somebody who drinks, like, I don't know, something really sweet before reading a moral vignette. They'll rate it much less harshly. So these disgust domains are all interrelated. They all play off of each other in ways that are really interesting. So, for instance, we know that people with OCD or OCPD have high disgust sensitivity, so they find things disgusting more frequently, and they also tend to rate other people's behaviors more harshly. So, this is an emotion that is relevant for those of you with OCD, OCPD, misophonia, PTSD, and Republicans, as we will see.
Yeah, and I think this is a really good topic now versus any other time in history because, well, I don't know about history, but in our lifetime. Because with the pandemic, you really have this real disgust. Disgust is this kind of emotion that keeps us safe from contaminants, right? Like something that's rotten or something poisonous. And, with the pandemic, with COVID-19, there's a lot of disgust for like, oh, that person like coughed on my face,
Yeah.
There's that disgust in response to preventing this pandemic, but also it's turned socially, as you were saying, like politically. It's disgusting when people don't wear masks. It's disgusting when people don't do the vaccine or do the vaccine, right? Or believe this or believe that. So there's a lot of this kind of like pulling away and like shrinking back from things we find gross.
I don't know how I hadn't thought of that. That's such a good point. Like, we've been seeing this moral disgust be so heightened over the past few years. But yeah, particularly in the pandemic, that is heightening people's like general kind of level of everyday disgust because there are contaminants everywhere. And we're also seeing a concomitant rise in moral disgust. So that's super cool. Yeah. Definitely a hypothesis that I don't know if it's been tested, but it would make sense.
Yeah, I mean, we literally tried to save our own lives by like social distancing, right? So it's actually tying two things together. Is like to keep yourself safe from being from getting sick by like not hanging out with certain people. Yeah. So it's really, this is kind of such a weird time for disgust, and there's a lot of it.
Yeah, when we think of the action urges of disgust, so what does disgust make us do? So it's a couple of kind of cool things. It makes us scrunch up our face, which is meant to, it seems like it's basically meant to reduce the sensory input you're getting while allowing you to maintain attention. So disgust also captures your attention. And if you think about it, it actually makes a lot of sense because if you're, a prehistoric nomad and you're trying to discover, like, is this meat safe to eat? There's something kind of disgusting about it. You want to be able to pay attention long enough to determine whether it's really a threat, but you don't want to be like breathing it in. And so that's just kind of like a physiological response to it. And the reason that's kind of interesting is if you think about something like misophonia, disgust is a big component of misophonia. It's one of the top like 3 or 4 cited emotions. And it's funny because this disgust is not doing them too many favors because if you have misophonia, all you really want to do is to be able to stop paying attention to the sounds. But disgust makes you pay attention longer. So actually, like, treating disgust can have kind of a nice, it can help the person like reduce the attention that they're putting towards those sounds.
Yeah, just so if people don't know, we talk about misophonia, but it's less well known, so I might as well define it again. But that's a condition that we're studying a lot of people who have a real negative response, emotional response to certain sounds. And yeah, I mean, just it's kind of cool even just to think about it. So it's so primal that when we scrunch up our face and pull away, apparently we're literally scrunching up our face, so we're blocking the nasal passages. So just in case there's something bad, and pulling away, as you can imagine, and like turning our face away, right? So all this is just kind of like, yeah, paying attention to it, trying to figure out what it is, and pulling away. And yeah, as you're saying, as we were kind of doing this research for this episode, I couldn't believe how many disorders have disgust in it.
Yeah.
And we mostly think of like, oh, I'm so anxious, I'm so depressed, I'm so angry, but we never I'm so disgusted with the world, and that's why I want to go to therapy. But it's a big part of these disorders.
What disorders did you find implicated with disgust?
Yeah, I mean, I just was reading a review paper that I'll talk a little bit about. It's called Treating Disgust and Anxiety Disorders by Mason and colleagues. And it's really fascinating how, we think about fear and we think about anger, about things that we don't like, right? But a lot of it could be rooted in disgust, something that you find gross. Like one big one that's probably pretty obvious is blood injection injury, right? Like seeing blood or seeing kind of injury, getting a shot, that's a kind of phobia, but a lot of that is based on being really disgusted that's a big one for me. That's yeah. As soon as I see that, I feel disgusted, but I don't really feel the disgust. It's all the fear, right? It's like, it's like the kind of like the response to protecting against that. So I don't feel the disgust for too long. But OCD with contamination worries, which is a subtype of OCD that people are constantly worried that if something isn't perfectly clean, they will get poisoned or they will get sick and die, right? Which, obviously got really, really heightened in the pandemic. But did you talk about earlier in the podcast about someone who had OCD is in response to sexual trauma?
Yeah, so this person was a follower story, told us we could use this in our podcast episodes. She was sexually abused in a church and developed OCD shortly after, basically, trying to rid herself of this contaminant, of this sexual abuse. And I think it started with obsessively cleaning the church itself, I believe. So when they get to church, cleaning the doorknob and the pew. And there are a couple different, disgust domains. And there's this kind of body envelope disgust. So a disgust towards things that kind of, the body envelope is basically your skin. It's the covering of your body.
Never heard of that term. That's such a
I know.
cool
I've only seen it in the disgust.
Gross, but
or envelope violations or something. So rape, sexual assault,
interesting. Okay.
Needles. Things that are literally sort of penetrating the envelope of the body. This is all related to animal reminder disgust, which is basically this is one of the 4 core domains of disgust. Is disgust towards things that remind us of our mortality and death, and the fact that we are animals, that we live in these kind of vulnerable bodies. So, so people can be higher in I think I'm kind of high in core disgust, but a little bit lower in animal reminder disgust. I don't mind watching plastic surgery videos. Or pimple popping videos or open heart surgery, stuff like that. I don't like seeing dead things, but I cannot deal with vomit. It's so disgusting.
It's funny. I was trying to think, do I have a high disgust? If I see any injury, I have the blood injection phobia is a highly heritable disorder, and I got it from my dad, who, if he sees any kind of blood or shot, he passes out. He was a 6'2" giant man, and he would just fall to the floor if he sees that. And I definitely have that too. So it's really hard. Like, this is why I never even considered a medical career, because I just can't see that. Yeah. And I do have, I'm starting to get more and more of this in pregnancy, actually. Disgust has been a real part of pregnancy that I didn't expect, where it's almost the interpersonal one is going up, where if I'm in a bar and it's, you know, more people are unmasked, or there's people who just seem like unwell or dangerous, I get like this, ugh, ew, like I don't want to go near them, because I guess I'm protecting this other thing, right?
Yeah.
And then, you know, it was just interesting too to read about how it can be really involved in post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. For example, there's this case study that Daglish and Power published in 2004, where they describe like this emergency caseworker who had to deal with a heavily decomposed corpse when she had to enter a home of a man who had killed himself weeks earlier. And she got really sick, right? Like, was intensely disgusted, vomited several times, as you can imagine. And as a result, she developed PTSD symptoms, like just pure based on the disgust. It's not what PTSD is usually a fear response, where you're afraid of something bad happening that you've experienced before. But she would wake up with repeated nightmares about the incident, and she would wake up feeling really sick and intrusive thoughts and just feeling that disgust response. So it's interesting how even just like a really disgusting event can create a PTSD response. And disgust is such a visceral, primal, like body response that it's just really hard to get rid of. So.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there was no threat to her safety there, but it was just so I can't even imagine that experience. That is
like getting grossed out ourselves just thinking about all these things. Yeah.
Yeah. Studies have shown that disgust sensitivity moderated the relationship between peritraumatic disgust and PTSD symptom severity. So what this means is that people with high disgust sensitivity had higher peritraumatic disgust. So, you know, basically around the time that the trauma happened, like if the trauma had a disgusting element, you know, and the people with higher disgust sensitivity then, you know, picked up on that more and then had more severe PTSD symptoms than people who did not. So, yeah, there's definitely evidence that it's implicated in PTSD, and you can develop PTSD without there being any threat to your safety at all.
Yeah. It's funny, you guys listening can't really see it, but right now I noticed something that we don't usually do. We're talking more quickly, and we're like, shit, I don't know, our shoulders are like, we're getting more tense. I've never seen that with our conversation, but even talking about these things, we're just, like pulling away from the camera and like making faces. So it's really, really visceral. This is really interesting.
Yeah. So I'll talk about then an antidote to disgust, and it comes from literature where it's just so funny. One thing that happens to be really disgusting, but human beings love it anyway, is sex. I mean, if you think about what sex actually is, it's connecting with our body parts that secrete things and, you know, have blood or feces involved or just, I know, right? And yet people keep having sex, even though you would think that this would like shoot up our core disgust to the stratosphere, like, you know, thinking about some of these things that we're willing to do to each other. But what studies have found is that arousal in general can lower somebody's disgust sensitivity.
Like sexual arousal or general arousal?
Both.
Oh, wow.
So
cool.
If you basically get somebody sexually aroused, like maybe you show them porn for 5 minutes and then you show another person a video of like a roller coaster, or maybe you put them in like a virtual reality roller coaster experience, and both of them will have attenuated disgust responses when you then present them with disgusting stimuli. So,
interesting.
But the sexually aroused people will have even greater reduced disgust when confronted with sexual related stimuli. Yeah.
That's weird.
Does that make sense? Well, I mean, so basically, like, if you can get the context of your arousal as like matched to the disgust stimuli as possible, it seems like maybe that's a way to reduce disgust. So like if I'm sexually aroused, but then you give me like this sexually gross stimulus, then I'm gonna be less grossed out than somebody who isn't sexually aroused.
Got it. Okay.
But if I've also been on a roller coaster, I'll also be less disgusted by it.
Huh.
Yeah.
So get sexually aroused before you look at vomit. So there you go. That's the tip of the day. No,
Yeah.
there's actually treatment strategies we'll talk about in a minute.
Well, I mean, you can see why this would be important, because there are situations where disgust might really come up, and arousal, like if you think about a battle, like warfare, people are dealing with blood and guts and really traumatic things, but because they're naturally aroused, you know, they're maybe not as affected by the disgusting stuff that they're dealing with. Yeah. And because we actually need to like replicate the species, it makes sense that being sexually aroused would help us deal with the natural grossness of sex. Also, arousal helps us approach more. So we're willing to like approach disgusting stimuli. There
you go.
Yeah. So if you need to solve your problems with disgust, just do some jumping jacks beforehand. It probably would help. Yeah. Or like, you know, watch a Sezzy video before you have to pick up your dog's poo.
This is a really weird episode, everyone.
Yeah. What else have we found? So, one thing that's cool is that, you know, I was talking about that study where if you have a gross beverage and then you'll read a moral vignette, then you'll rate it then more harshly. That actually works in reverse as well. So if you give people...
What's a moral vignette? Like what kind of story, like what kind of vignette are we talking about here?
So let's say like a story of a crime.
Uh-huh.
Maybe there's some kind of ambiguous element about this, like that would cause some people to rate it like less harshly than others. Maybe it's a vignette about a sexual practice. Like maybe it's a vignette about two cousins having sex.
So like a story where the moral implications, like you don't know if it's like morally right or wrong. It's just this like ethical scenario. Okay, got it.
Yeah. So if you give people really strong moral vignettes, like, oh, it's, you know, it's really bad, and then you give them a neutral beverage, they'll rate that neutral beverage as tasting gross. Versus if you give somebody a nice vignette, a story about somebody helping somebody, and then give them that neutral beverage, they'll rate it as sweet.
Interesting.
Yeah. It's pretty cool. Pretty cool. So let's talk about some of the treatments for disgust, because there's actually a study showing that disgust reappraisal can change your political beliefs. Cool. That's one I wanted to talk about real quick. But Kibby, what did you find in your review?
Yeah, so that Treating Disgust and Anxiety Disorders paper, get a really nice review of different kinds of just, you know, intervention or treatment strategies, or strategies that you can use for yourself if you find yourself very disgusted with the world right now. And keep in mind that there's not a ton of research here. So this is a really new and unexplored area compared to, like, you know, how to deal with fear. And the funny thing is that the way we deal with fear, we've talked about this, you know, many times in our podcast, but exposure is really the big one, right? Which is if you have, let's say I'm afraid of dogs. If I expose myself, if I hang out with a dog over and over and over again, I learn that they're not actually that dangerous, and that reduces fear and anxiety over time. That does not really work with disgust. If you show a disgusting picture over and over and over again, it doesn't actually reduce the disgust too much. So there's a couple strategies that the review talked about, which I think are really cool. One is there is a behavioral strategy. It's called counter conditioning. So instead of just looking at the disgusting picture over and over and over again, if you take a picture and, you know, that has a disgusting association with it, if you pair that picture with another kind of feeling that is like that contradicts the disgust, like pleasant or appetizing, and you do that over and over, then it could possibly reduce the disgust. So something that you find disgusting, pair it with something that's kind of like nice or pleasant or calming or appetite, like something delicious or something. I don't know what situation you'd be in, but I guess maybe someone from the opposite political spectrum, if you just have an amazing, affair with that person, an amazing relationship, then maybe it will reduce disgust. I don't know.
Oh, well, yeah, that would make sense. I mean, I'm imagining I'm cleaning up Selkie's vomit and then Paul brings me like a delicious piece of cake. It just seems like I wouldn't want to eat that piece of cake at that particular moment.
Maybe nice music, maybe nice candles at the same time, right? Like something that actually just associates the disgusting thing. I mean, of course, the disgust might not go away entirely, but it does lessen the disgust. So you mentioned that there's cognitive strategies that there's some research on. And when we say cognitive, we mean like working with your thoughts and beliefs. So there's a couple of cool ones, strategies that could work. One is instead of thinking to yourself why something is not disgusting, that doesn't really work. What you should do instead is focusing on really rethinking what the disgusting thing is. So there's two strategies within that: conceptual reorientation and deconstruction. So conceptual reorientation is just changing the way you see what the thing is. So an example is if you're given a cup of curdled milk, instead of it thinking about it curdled milk, think of it as like yogurt. Or on its way to becoming cheese, right? something that's,
that does help.
Yeah, seeing something that you thought was going to be bad for you into something that's actually not bad for you, not poisonous.
How do I do that with Selkie's poo? I mean, with Selkie's vomit. Selkie's my dog, and what she does is she goes into a litter box, she eats the cat poo, and then vomits it up. And it is the most revolting experience that we have to live through over and over. We try to do everything we can to keep her away from the litter box, but this dog has a nutrient deficit or something that is making her go back. Why are you...
Maybe seeing it as like not vomit, but just seeing it as just like litter. Like just seeing it as like wet litter. Ugh, that's still gross, but maybe
that once was.
But or maybe stew. You just look at it and you're like, oh, you spilled some stew on the floor, right?
Oh my God.
It does have some tricking yourself. Like some of it could be, but if Paul wants you to clean up the vomit on the floor, he'd be like, oh no, I spilled some stew on the floor. Can you or like I spilled some of the wet litter on the floor. Can you please clean it up? It won't be gross, but maybe less gross than choose.
If anybody has suggestions, feel free to DM me, because this is a real
this is a real problem. So that's one. Just imagining the thing that it's gross to you is something else that's not gross to you. The other one is the other part of that is deconstruction. So that's really interesting. That's really taking a different approach to looking at the thing. So for example, if you are watching a video of like, some kind of surgery, right? Like an arm being amputated, right? Of course that would, for me, that would just be disgusting and also just, I'd probably pass out. But if I approach it like I'm training to be a doctor, I'm trying to learn how someone would do this kind of surgery, right? Using like a clinical detached perspective, then maybe you could feel less disgust. And like with moral disgust too, or interpersonal disgust, like in my personal life, there might be things that people do that kind of gross me out. But if I look at it like I'm a psychologist trying to understand why some people would like hurt others or, go out and cough on people's faces during the pandemic. Like if I'm trying to understand it from a clinical detached perspective, that could actually change the disgust response.
Yeah, I think that works for me pretty well. I often say, people get mad at me for playing devil's advocate a lot and, not wanting to condemn bad behavior or like finding excuses. And I'm like, well, my job is to see the good in people and to be interested, rather than judgmental. And that really does lower like disgust I might feel towards them, because I'm not just I'm not supposed to be a judgmental observer. I'm supposed to listen to what they're telling me and find the reasons for it rather than like find the justice for it in a sense.
Right. So you could, even if something grosses you out, you could try to think about it. Like, let's say the pandemic, you try to think about it from like, I'm trying to understand the biology of it. I'm trying to understand it. Like, I'm an EMT or medical provider or nurse, like trying to learn about what this is, right? From like this kind of intellectual perspective. So those are some strategies. Another one that's really cool, it's something that we do a lot in emotion regulation treatment, is changing your own reactions to a disgust response, right? Like, let's say you're just going to be like, there's no way we could change how grossed out you are with Selkie's vomit, right? It sounds gross on multiple levels. Totally get it. But so instead of, some people have a lot of kind of judgmental responses to their own emotions, right? Like if they're sad or afraid, they're like, oh, it's so dumb that I feel this way. I shouldn't feel this way. I can't possibly handle it. If I feel this emotion, I might feel it forever and won't be able to pull myself out. So a lot of people have these kind of beliefs about their own emotional reactions, and disgust can be one where it could be an area that you can work with. So if you're cleaning up the vomit and you think to yourself, oh, if I get that nausea feeling or if I feel disgusted, I'm just going to implode. I'm going to have to run away and I'm going to vomit. I'm going to collapse and I can't cope with this. Then you could kind of work with your own beliefs about that. Like, no, I can cope with this. I've done this before. It's going to be gross and I'm going to feel disgust, but that disgust will go away. So just like thoughts about your own feelings of disgust and knowing that you can cope with it. And part of that is also normalizing your feelings of disgust. Like if disgust is part of your anxiety disorder or OCD or something, you could be like, no, I listened to this podcast episode. Disgust is a normal feeling in these situations, and it's okay that I feel it. And it's an emotion just like any others. They will come and go.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, I mean, that's so crucial for all of our emotions. I want to talk about this study about disgust reappraisal changing your political beliefs. So basically what these study authors found is that disgust sensitivity is associated with greater conservatism. And so basically conservative attitudes, specifically towards same-sex marriage and abortion. I'm not sure if this study included, I don't know how many like items like that they included, but so these are two that they found to be significantly associated with disgust sensitivity. And they also hypothesized that even with disgust sensitivity as it is, they assumed that liberals use more reappraisal strategies for disgust than conservatives. And this was found to be true. So basically, they found that people who are conservative tend to reappraise their disgust less often than people who are liberal. They have stronger disgust sensitivity, so higher disgust sensitivity. And so when we talk about a reappraisal, that's basically just what Kibbe was going over, these kind of cognitive techniques for reducing your emotion. And they found that this was actually unique to disgust. So it's not necessarily that conservatives don't reappraise their anger or their fear as much as liberals, that this is just has to do with disgust. And so in this study, patients were given vignettes that described sexually deviant but harmless acts. One common one I believe used in this study is a person buys a dead chicken and has sex with a dead chicken. Okay, Ooh. So yeah, I know that's actually a vignette that's commonly used in the moral disgust research. Ooh. Okay. Yeah, so I believe that was one of the vignettes. They were asked to rate their disgust and describe their thought processes while reading. So again, they found that conservatism was correlated with higher disgust and lower reappraisal. Then they had liberals and conservatives view a film of homosexual men kissing. So the control group just watched the film while the reappraisal group was asked to think about the film in such a way that they felt nothing at all. So that was their only instruction. And then afterwards, they were asked to rate their opinion on the morality of homosexuality and their support for same-sex marriage. What they found was that those in the reappraisal condition were significantly more accepting of homosexual relationships and expressed more support for gay marriage. And this was true for conservatives in that condition as well. So they wound up with conservatives and liberals having statistically equivalent views towards homosexual relationships.
That's interesting. I wonder
Yeah,
what
I
the
mean,
reappraisals were. I mean, we're talking about the different strategies of thinking about like what the vignette or the act was that might reduce disgust, and I wonder with it, with homosexuality, I'm just guessing that we would say like, oh, this is an act of love, right? This or, but I
I
don't
think
know how you would reappraise that having sex with a chicken.
I think so in that study they didn't have, well, they didn't have any, they didn't direct them to reappraise. They just like asked them, I think, basically like, did you use any of these kinds of strategies? Did you,
Okay.
for instance, like, did you try to feel differently about this, while you read this vignette? This is the second condition. The second study is when they brought in the homosexual kissing, and basically they wiped out any difference in opinion between liberals and conservatives just using disgust reappraisal.
Interesting. Wow.
Yeah. It's unfortunate here that it's like we're using homosexual men as a disgusting example, but it is showing that perhaps like this kind of conservative like disgust response might be at play here, and then that's like one thing that can reduce bigoted attitudes, is teaching them how to reappraise. And in that study, it sounds like they just said, think about it in such a way that you feel nothing at all. So I think they left the reappraisal strategy up to the person, but I would have to go into the study more, because I feel like you could also use suppression for that.
I'm trying to think about how, for kind of distill all of these insights into tips for loved ones, how to help someone else someone you love feel less disgust for things. I mean, we could talk about, associating things that you find disgusting with something nice, or just saying, kind of saying, like, normalizing, validating someone's feelings of disgust, or saying, oh, this is not actually something disgusting, this is actually something else, so that's not harmful. But I imagine with, a lot of people are probably thinking about this in the sense of political divide, right? Like,
Yeah.
how can someone who feels like identifies as liberal change their disgust response in their more conservative families or things like that? This is a common request we get. And I wonder if it does make sense to go into discussions about these things. And, if it's talking about cognitive reappraisal, like looking at homosexuality as an act of love, right? And having that kind of conversation, if people are open to it, I wonder if that's actually a way of bridging the divide. And so this like echo chamber and not having like deep discussions about these kind of moral questions is kind of detracting from ability.
I think that's exactly what we're seeing, because this divide is causing echo chambers. So what we just saw in the study is if people can think differently about a topic, their disgust will go down and they will become more accepting of it. When you're in an echo chamber, all you're hearing is that behavior is disgusting. That your disgust response is being inflated and validated instead of challenged, right?
Right. And they're doing the thing that is not helpful, which is like, no, this is not disgusting. Abortion, gay rights, this is not disgusting.
Right.
It's great. But, that doesn't actually help to just tell someone that this is not disgusting. It helps to tell them that this is not harmful, right?
Yeah. I think another point actually about the political divide can be made in this last study that I found, which was looking at whether people experience anger or disgust. And how the target of an action or behavior. So basically, okay, sorry, this is kind of difficult to explain, but basically the study looked at, like, let's say there's a moral transgression, like somebody steals your coat from a party. They found that if somebody steals your coat, you're more likely to feel anger. If somebody steals somebody else's coat, you're more likely to feel disgust. And their hypothesis is that you kind of make this implicit calculation about, like, what is the like relative risk of feeling these emotions, because anger and disgust make you do two different, like, very different behaviors. Disgust makes you, like, withdraw and run away and, like, judge from a distance. Anger makes you confront. So the cost of confronting somebody who stole somebody else's coat is typically higher than confronting somebody who stole your coat, because additional things are going into this calculation. Like, I want my coat back. You want your coat back probably more than you want somebody else's coat back for them. And so that kind of raises or like lowers the price of confronting them, because you're like, okay, I get this additional thing. You also might be thinking things like, I'm not going to allow myself to be stepped on. I'm not going to be a doormat. I'm going to stand up for myself. Like, all of these kinds of like variables enter into this equation. And so basically, like, it winds up lowering the cost of a direct confrontation. While, like, being disgusted on behalf of others, you don't, the cost of confronting something or confronting someone when, like, you haven't personally been targeted is much higher, right? Like, you have less of a reason to do it. And so instead you feel disgust, where you can just withdraw and judge. Does that make sense?
That's interesting. It does. And it kind of highlights the principle that we might feel certain emotions based on satisfying our needs in the moment, right? Like, if I feel really grossed out by something, I might either feel fear or anger, depending on what would help me deal with that situation. Like, if I see someone having an injury, fear might happen because I might, really want to back away and run away, right? But if someone coughed on my face, like, I'm going to feel anger because I'm protecting myself through, like, saying, what are you doing? Come on, this is the pandemic. Get on my face,
Yeah, well, I think it's really interesting to think about how our society has changed in ways that might up the chances of experiencing one or both of these emotions. Like, social media is such a contemptuous place. Contempt is related to moral disgust. So constantly we see this, like, becoming offended on behalf of others. Being incredibly contemptuous about, like, other people's behavior that actually doesn't affect you at all. You're just, like, looking at somebody else's tweets or social media or something. So you might not be angry because it's not directed at you, but you'll be disgusted instead. But what social media also does is it reduces the cost of direct confrontation in a way, because you're confronting somebody over, like, a DM versus it face to face. For some people, other people, it might raise the cost because of, like, reputational damage. So I am not going to be confronting anybody over social media, because I know it could, like, wind up biting me in the ass, right? Because I'm a little bit more visible. So I don't know. I wonder if kind of changing these costs is creating a bit of a problem where suddenly people are, like, angry and disgusted all the time.
That's interesting. That's really interesting to think about.
Yeah, I also kind of would want to repeat that political reappraisal study, because it almost feels like the disgust level of liberals has gone up in recent years. Yeah,
I imagine there's just, like, especially because people might want to convince someone else of their own disgust response, right? Like, this is disgusting, this is not disgusting. We are so staunch in our efforts that we don't want to change it. We want other people to also believe it too. So,
Awesome. Well, hopefully that was some food for thought. I just think it's such an interesting topic, and one that I would like to explore more. And related to that, Kibby, what are some resources?
So my first resource is always to watch Inside Out, the Disney movie that describes different emotions. And Mindy Kaling does the voice for the Disgust character. And so if anyone wants just a fun exploration of what that looks like, it's watch that movie. There's a book that I just looked up. It's called Disgust, a Memoir by Stephanie Grant. And I haven't read it myself, but it's apparently a very funny and vulnerable exploration of the most difficult emotions, both in our private lives and collective imaginations. So that's a good book that you could check out. That seems to be very approachable. If you are interested, again, it's Disgust, a Memoir by Stephanie Grant.
Fabulous. Well, if any of you are disgusted with yourselves for not yet rating, reviewing, and subscribing to our show, please do so now, and we'll see you next week. By accessing this podcast, I acknowledge that the hosts of this podcast make no warranty, guarantee, or representation as to the accuracy or sufficiency of the information featured in this podcast. The information, opinions, and recommendations presented in this podcast are for general information only, and any reliance on the information provided in this podcast is done at your own risk. This podcast and any and all content or services available on or through this podcast are provided for general, non-commercial informational purposes only and do not constitute the practice of medical or any other professional judgment, advice, diagnosis, or treatment, and should not be considered or used as a substitute for the independent professional judgment, advice, diagnosis, or treatment of a duly licensed and qualified healthcare provider. In case of a medical emergency, you should immediately call 911. The hosts do not endorse, approve, recommend, or certify any information, product, process, service, or organization presented or mentioned in this podcast, and information from this podcast should not be referenced in any way to imply such approval or endorsement.